In 1996, the Chicago Bulls were about to accomplish something so extraordinary, it had never been seen before and may never be truly repeated. The final tally was staggering: 72 wins, a near impenetrable home record with just 2 defeats, and a title won on Father's Day by a superstar still processing the tragic loss of his own father. But the popular story about that team misses a crucial point. None of it was guaranteed. A mere 18 months earlier, the situation was chaotic. Michael Jordan was trying his hand at minor league baseball, and Scottie Pippen was demanding to be traded. And the player who would become their essential third star, he had just been offloaded for a backup center, an asset no other team even wanted. So the question is, how did a group of 3 one-star returning from retirement, another desperate to leave, and a third who was considered radioactive by the entire league, forge the very foundation of the most dominant team ever created? This narrative is about much more than just 72 wins. It's about a high-stakes gamble by the front office and a coaching ideology drawn from Native American spirituality, all ignited by one man's burning rage at being humiliated, which transformed a broken roster into a force basketball had never encountered. We're going to deconstruct precisely how Jerry Krause assembled this team, examine why Phil Jackson's system was the only framework capable of managing these massive egos, and pinpoint the defining moments of this legendary journey. And our story must begin with the one man who rarely got the credit he deserved, because without his vision, none of this would have ever happened. For Pippen, Scottie Pippen, right in his face. Rodman diving for the rebound. What a tremendous effort. That was a 3. Rebound taken, drives inside. Jordan denied the shot with 5 on the clock. Yes, the Bulls. You could say Phil Jackson was the brilliant chef, but he still required someone to procure the finest ingredients. That critical responsibility belonged to Jerry Krause. A Chicago native through and through, Krause had dedicated decades to life as a scout and team executive before he was put in charge of the Bulls' basketball operations in 1985. What set him apart was not personal magnetism or star quality. It was his relentless, methodical talent assessment and an all-consuming obsession with roster architecture. Krause was the architect behind the trade for Scottie Pippen and the drafting of Horace Grant in 1987, moves that formed the very bedrock of Chicago's first championship dynasty. He also relentlessly lobbied the organization to hire Phil Jackson as an assistant coach years before Jackson became a celebrated figure, back when he was still coaching in obscure minor leagues and overseas. But Krause's sphere of influence extended well beyond simply acquiring players. He was known for making cold, often deeply unpopular choices that put long-range success ahead of personal allegiances, even when it led to direct confrontation with Michael Jordan. In 1988, Krause traded Charles Oakley, one of Jordan's closest friends and his on-court bodyguard, firmly believing the Bulls needed superior size and skill to be a long-term contender. The following year, he fired head coach Doug Collins directly against Jordan's wishes and promoted Phil Jackson, convinced that a system-first philosophy was the only way to elevate the team beyond individual greatness. That friction was made even more intense by the fact that Krause and Jordan were polar opposites in every conceivable fashion. Jordan was tall, charismatic, a hyper-competitive force of nature, the ultimate alpha. Krause was short, overweight, socially graceless, and obsessively analytical. A lifelong executive who valued cold calculation over bravado. In Jordan's mind, Krause, whom he nicknamed Crumbs, was the very personification of management, constantly reinforcing the idea that no one, not even the greatest player alive, was bigger than the organization. That philosophy ultimately yielded championships, but it also guaranteed that Krause and Jordan would never be on the same page in the history books. They would only ever compete under the same banner. The groundwork for the 95-96 Bulls was laid in the immediate aftermath of Chicago's first three-peat. It all started with Tony Kukoc. In July of 1993, the Bulls culminated a 4-year pursuit by signing Kukoc to a landmark 8-year, $17.6 million contract. And while the legend often centers on how Krause's public fascination with Kukoc irritated Jordan and Pippen during the 1992 Olympics, it overlooks the incredible foresight needed to even identify him in the first place. Krause had drafted Kukoc in the second round during an era when European talent, especially skilled big men who could operate on the perimeter, was largely dismissed. He envisioned a 6'10" forward with the ball-handling skills of a guard and a silky three-point shot well before the league was prepared for that type of player. Next to join were Steve Kerr and Bill Wennington. For Kerr, Chicago was his 4th NBA destination. Wennington was re-entering the league after a 2-year stint in Italy, making the Bulls his 3rd NBA franchise. Then, in February 1994, Krause made a game-changing decision. shipping Stacey King to Minnesota for Luke Longley. This was both an admission of a past error and a calculated risk for Krause. He had chosen King 6th overall back in 1989, overriding Phil Jackson's strong preference for Shawn Kemp. Longley, the 7th selection in 1991, had been an unreliable starter in Minnesota, but at 7'2", he stood 3 inches taller than King, was 2 years younger, and commanded nearly an identical salary. The coaching staff was convinced that Longley was a far better match for Phil Jackson's intricate triangle offense. They saw a true 7-footer who could facilitate, set screens, and command space in the paint without needing the ball in his hands. That confidence was paramount. The coaches wanted him because they saw a center who would perform the thankless tasks the system required, which in turn would elevate the play of everyone else on the floor. That 1994 roster was quietly the genesis of the new Bulls. Even after losing the best player on the planet, Chicago won just 2 fewer games than they had the season prior. Much of that resilience was owed to younger, more versatile talent. The Bulls swapped out 33-year-old Trent Tucker, 31-year-old Rodney McRae, and 31-year-old Darrell Walker for Kukoc, Kerr, and Wennington. Stalwart veterans Bill Cartwright and John Paxson saw their playing time diminish, with their minutes being absorbed by Longley and Pete Myers. Still powered by 6 of the top 7 players from the 93 roster, the 1994 Bulls were sustained by the championship core's residual energy. By 1995, however, that foundation began to fracture. Horace Grant left the team after a drawn-out and acrimonious departure. The Bulls took that money and invested it in Ron Harper, believing he could fill some of the scoring gap Jordan had left behind. Instead, Harper was demoted from the starting lineup and was playing less than 7 minutes per game by the 1995 playoffs. Even so, by that year, 7 pillars of what would become the second three-peat were already in Chicago. Pippen, Kukoc, Kerr, Wennington, Longley, Harper, and Judd Buechler. And ever so slowly, the team's entire philosophy began to evolve, shifting away from a collection of players hunting for their own shot. And the entire landscape of professional basketball had shifted between Michael Jordan's departure in 1993 and his dramatic return in March of 1995. The league was different, the Bulls were a changed team, and the assumption of Chicago's unending dominance had completely vanished. With Jordan pursuing a baseball career in Birmingham, the Bulls dynasty crumbled into a team trying to find its new identity. They were still a quality opponent, disciplined and dangerous, but the fear they once inspired was gone. Scottie Pippen had risen to become the team's undisputed new leader, and a fresh cast of players, including Luke Longley, Steve Kerr, Bill Wennington, and Judd Buechler, carved out new roles in a locker room, redefined by Jordan's absence. Then, Jordan walked back through the door. While he was undeniably the same legendary figure, his return was a seismic event for the players who had joined the team after 1993. His comeback was an immediate system shock. There was no time for a gentle reacclimation. It came with an all-consuming mandate to win a championship. For the teammates who hadn't experienced the first three-peat, it demanded an overnight recalibration of their goals and a harsh lesson in what true greatness required. Chicago made it to the playoffs in both 94 and 95, but without Jordan leading the charge, there were no championship celebrations. Their season ended in the second round, first against the Knicks in 1994 and then against the Magic in 1995. The NBA's throne was unoccupied, and the league had already begun to crown new kings. When Jordan rejoined the team late in the 94 to 95 season, he brought hope, but the old Magic wasn't instantly there. He put up only 24.8 points on a cold 39.4% shooting in his first 4 games. That was before he delivered the powerful statement everyone was waiting for, a 55-point masterpiece at Madison Square Garden. The performance was crowned by a game-winning assist to Bill Wennington in the final seconds. The genius was clearly still present, but so was the lack of conditioning. The Bulls finished with a 13-4 record following his return. They handled Charlotte in the opening round before colliding with the Orlando Magic. The situation heavily favored Orlando. Jordan was still getting his basketball legs back under him. Chicago was far from a polished, finished team. The series was dominated by Shaquille O'Neal and Penny Hardaway. Former Bull Horace Grant added another layer of rivalry, and Orlando ultimately sent Chicago packing. The single most memorable moment occurred in Game 1, with fewer than 20 seconds to play, when Nick Anderson famously stripped Jordan to clinch the victory. In a post-game interview, Anderson declared, "Number 45 is not number 23. I couldn't have done that to number 23. Jordan promptly switched back to number 23 for Game 2, scoring 38 points in a dominant win, but the Bulls were nevertheless defeated in 6 games on their home court. Ron Harper recalled the immediate aftermath. "We were all sitting in the locker room, and Michael just says, 'We're going to start working out.' I asked, when? And he said, we start tomorrow. They want to see number 23? I'm going to give them number 23. The public narrative that followed centered on Jordan's failures, but his actual statistics told a very different story. He averaged 31.5 points, 6.5 rebounds, 4.5 assists, 2.3 steals, and 1.4 blocks per game after being away from the sport for almost 2 full years. Still, the loss was what mattered most, and it awakened something fierce within him. That summer, Jordan attacked his training with an obsessive intensity. While on the Warner Brothers lot to film Space Jam, he demanded that the studio build him a professional-grade basketball court. He also had them construct a private gym, a facility that would become known throughout the league as the Jordan Dome. Anyone who participated in those now legendary pickup games understood very quickly that this was not a player gently working his way back into shape. This was a conqueror preparing for his next campaign. But even with Jordan's fire burning brighter than ever and the roster nearly finalized, Phil Jackson recognized a critical flaw that was still holding the team back. Orlando had simply overpowered Chicago with its size on the perimeter, fielding the 6'7" Penny Hardaway, the 6'6" Nick Anderson, the 6'8" Dennis Scott, and the 6'6" Brian Shaw. They were surrounded by towering guards. Jackson had already experimented with Scottie Pippen initiating the offense for parts of the game, but he began to conceive of a much grander and more radical lineup. What if he could overwhelm the court with exceptional size and wingspan at the guard position? The idea wasn't just to generate mismatches offensively, but to asphyxiate opposing teams on defense in ways they were completely unprepared for. To turn this idea into reality, Jerry Krause and Jackson leveraged the 1995 expansion draft. The rules allowed each team to protect 8 players while losing a maximum of 1. The Bulls shielded their clear-cut core, Jordan, Pippen, Kukoc, and Kerr, and also protected all 3 of their centers, Longley, Perdue, and Wennington. Krause's priority was maintaining roster flexibility. He was already laying the groundwork to trade either Longley or Perdue, and with new franchises in Toronto and Vancouver, he knew he could not afford to leave Bill Wennington exposed. A Canadian-born center was the exact kind of player those new organizations would be tempted to select for marketing purposes alone. That strategy left one major name unprotected, BJ Armstrong. The fans were floored. He was a former All-Star and a crowd favorite, but that was entirely by design. By presenting the most attractive player available, the Bulls all but guaranteed that Armstrong and no one else would be the player taken from their team. As anticipated, Toronto selected him first overall. The move immediately cleared a path for Ron Harper to become the starting point guard. It allowed Kerr to settle into his specialized shooting role, and it freed up Armstrong's contract money to acquire the final piece of the puzzle, a power forward. Phil wanted Derek Coleman. Jordan wanted Jason Williams. Krause knew that superstars like Barkley, Kemp, or Larry Johnson were simply not obtainable. It was at this point that the conversation pivoted to one specific player Krause had famously sworn was not our kind of person. That person was Dennis Rodman, a whirlwind of energy on the court, famous for saving impossible plays and relentlessly attacking the boards. Rodman was still the premier rebounder in the entire world, but by 1995, he was considered toxic by most of the league. His time with San Antonio had descended into pure chaos, filled with mispractices and public defiance. His talent was undeniable, but his volatility was a major question. While most front offices saw an unacceptable risk, the Bulls saw a unique opportunity. With Longley's continued improvement, Will Perdue had become expendable. Krause sent Perdue to San Antonio for Rodman, and with that single move, the roster was complete. The masterful vision Phil Jackson had been constructing could finally be unleashed. The team now had size without being slow, and incredible versatility without clashing egos. Phil persuaded Tony Kukoc to become the league's most dangerous sixth man. Longley settled in as the starter. Rodman became the defense's relentless heart. Harper took over for Armstrong, and the Chicago Bulls evolved into something the NBA had never conceived of before. They had a versatile roster capable of dominating with size or overwhelming with speed, all while maintaining its core identity. The plan looked flawless on paper, but for it to endure a full season, the relentless travel, the powerful egos, the inevitable conflicts, Phil Jackson had one last hurdle to clear. He needed to make it all connect on a human level. The foundation of the Bulls dynasty rests on Phil Jackson's influence. The notion that just any coach could have led Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen to 6 championships completely misses the essence of their success. Jordan was already the most gifted player on the planet long before Phil came into the picture. What Jackson brought was a system. He cultivated an atmosphere where stars could excel without fracturing the team. Every single player, from the franchise legend to the last guy on the bench, accepted one fundamental truth. Self-expression was encouraged, but the collective always took precedence. That equilibrium was the essence of Phil's philosophy. He required total commitment on the basketball court, yet he allowed his players complete freedom to be themselves off of it. That is why Dennis Rodman never worried him. This freedom, however, was tied to a great deal of responsibility. Rodman had to embrace the triangle offense, and more significantly, he needed to leave behind the baggage of his bad boy image. Before the season truly got underway, Jackson ensured that old conflicts were resolved. Rodman accepted his past and apologized. Scottie accepted his apology. Jordan gave his blessing. And only then was Dennis fully embraced by the team. But Rodman wasn't the initial star. Phil had to integrate into his system. That distinction belonged to Michael Jordan. Jackson challenged the most phenomenal scorer the sport had ever witnessed to make a sacrifice, to give up the hunt for, scoring championships, and pursue something more meaningful. The message was straightforward. Personal greatness does not guarantee a title. Jordan wasn't thrilled with the idea at first, but he saw the logic. And the moment he committed, the rest of the players followed his lead. Phil's command of the team only grew stronger during Jordan's retirement. Without Michael Jordan, the group was forced to truly become Phil's team. Scottie was the leader by action, but Jackson was the leader by his sheer presence. He never pandered to his stars. He never went looking for their validation. His words had power because they were never diluted. By the time Jordan came back, the Bulls had already been completely reformed by Jackson's principles. Seasoned veterans took the place of younger players who were just looking for playing time. Every man's role was clearly established. All egos were brought into alignment. The locker room transformed from a competitive space into a unified one. Each player knew precisely how they contributed. This was the true brilliance of Phil Jackson. He understood when to push his stars and when to give them space. He held the belief that a coach's influence has an expiration date, and he collaborated with the front office to ensure the team's purpose stayed sharp. Jerry Krause acquired the talent. Jackson made them a cohesive unit. And in spite of their near constant disagreements, they constructed a team where explosive personalities didn't clash. They harmonized. And indeed, the result was magnificent. Michael Jordan. Oh, go jump high for the board. The 95-96 Bulls finished 72-10, achieving an 87% winning record, which was the greatest regular season in the history of the NBA at that point, eclipsing the legendary 1972 Lakers. They unleashed an 18-game winning streak, held a 41-3 record by the start of February, and were the very first team to ever hit 70 wins, ultimately finishing with 72 before a cheering home crowd. They compiled a 39-2 record at the United Center. They captured 33 victories on the road, a number that remains among the highest ever recorded. Jordan topped the league in scoring with 30.4 points per game. Pippen loaded the stat sheet with 19.4 points, 6.4 rebounds, and 5.9 assists. Kukoc offered consistent scoring from the bench, and Rodman owned the boards every single night. A historic achievement had already been secured, but the ultimate challenge was still ahead. Chicago blazed a path through the playoffs. They swept Miami in the first round, secured a predictable win against New York, and then came the showdown everyone had been anticipating: Orlando. On this occasion, there was no uncertainty, no rust, and no compassion. The Bulls swept the Magic, avenging the painful loss from the previous year and seizing back the Eastern Conference with absolute dominance. They conceded only a single game through 3 rounds on their way to the finals. The Seattle Supersonics were waiting for them. Chicago roared out to a 3-0 series lead before conceding 2 games in Seattle. Game 6 brought the series back to Chicago on Father's Day. Jordan's shooting was off, but he orchestrated everything else. He drove hard to the basket. He earned his points from the free throw line. He grabbed rebounds. He made plays. He finished the job, trying to draw contact. No call, but Longley got it to Jordan. Here's Jordan. The step on Purdue. Jordan with the put-back point lead. Here is Jordan kicking it out. 22 points, 9 rebounds, 7 assists. Another championship. Back in the locker room, the gravity of the moment finally overwhelmed him. Jordan collapsed to the floor, overcome with emotion. His father had been gone for 3 years. This was the first championship he had secured without him being there. The immense pressure he had been carrying was finally released. Jordan was named Finals MVP, averaging 27.3 points throughout the series. The Bulls had secured their 4th title, and the second three-peat had officially commenced. Jordan captured the MVP, the scoring title, the Finals MVP, All-NBA honors, and All-Defense honors, Pippen was a top contender for both the MVP and the Defensive Player of the Year awards. Both were selected for the first team All-N, BA, and All-Defense. This particular team is a testament to an eternal truth. Championships are not secured through talent alone. And in a modern league defined by parity, player, mobility, load management, and perpetual flux, it is possible we will never witness a team quite like the 95-96 Chicago Bulls ever again. They were flawlessly assembled, masterfully coached, and fueled by a purpose that transcended the game of basketball. Jerry Krause assembled the components. Phil Jackson made them a perfect fit. And Michael Jordan was fueled by an inferno that no defense could ever hope to extinguish. But the incredible part is that this Bulls squad would go on to capture 2 more world championships right after this. The epic of how those teams were assembled and ultimately torn down remains one of the most captivating sagas in the annals of the NBA. This dynasty's reign wasn't ended by failure on the court. It collapsed because the very architects of the empire couldn't overcome their own internal conflicts. If you want the complete, unfiltered story of how this dynasty maintained its dominance and why it finally imploded, drop a comment below and make sure you subscribe, because the unraveling of the Bulls is every bit as compelling as their legendary rise to greatness.